This is the video where I film myself for an hour just sipping water. Looking really serious. Aren't you lucky? No, I'm back. It's, I don't know, what is it? March 27th, Saturday, 2021. I think it's the 27th. I don't know. It's the last Saturday in March for 2021. And I'm here to talk about an album that means a lot to me. Tonight, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite albums. And I've decided that as I go through my record collection, which I did today, I do most weekends, I pull out stuff that I think is worth a discussion. I'm always pulling stuff out. I've got records over here you can't see, and over here and behind me. I'm always pulling stuff out, thinking I'm going to talk about that. And tonight, I'm going to talk about an album that I've listened to more times than I can count. And I think I know a lot about. I've listened to it for over 30 years. And as time goes on, when people ask me what some of my favorite albums are, I've realized that my favorite albums are just the ones I've listened to a lot. It kind of sneaks up on you. At least it sneaks up on me. I'll repeatedly listen to an album over the years. And in my head, it doesn't occur to me that it's one of my favorite albums. I'm just listening to it. It's a go-to selection. But over the years, I realized that there are certain albums that I just return to year in and year out. They never get old. I love them more and more each time I listen to them. And it dawns on me, yes, this is absolutely, without a question of a doubt, one of my favorite albums. And one of those is this. Skinny Puppy Rabies, released in 1989. This album means a lot to me, and I'll try to explain why and talk about it. This album came out when I was a senior in high school, and I was completely intertwined and ensconced in everything that was industrial and techno and electronic and electro pop, and you know, I loved punk too. I mean, I've always loved music in general, but if you were alive in the late 80s and you were old enough to be paying attention and buying records as I was, the rave scene was happening, and I was definitely getting, you know, completely distracted by that. But up until that point, it was mainly a lot of industrial and new wave and any other genre tag you want to throw out there. And Skinny Puppy was definitely one of my favorite groups leading up to that time. I'd heard all of their albums up to that time, but I just recently got into them again. I was only 16, 17 at the time. And so I was familiar with, you know, Remission and Mind the Perpetual Intercourse and Vivisex 6 and those other Skinny Puppy classics from the 80s. And pretty much everything Skinny Puppy did in the 80s is great. Everything they ever did is great, but their best stuff is in the 80s, I think. And then this album dropped in 1989, and there was a lot of hype behind this for one specific reason. Al Jourgensen. Al Jourgensen came in and produced and mixed this album. Al Jourgensen, of course, is from Ministry and Revolting Cocks and PTP and Acid Horse and Palehead and Lard, you know, Buck Satan in the 666 Shooters. Al Jourgensen is a star. He is a legend. He's Al Jourgensen. He's Al. Those of you who've been paying attention to music at all in the last 30, 35 years will know Al Jourgensen. He just is, in my mind, he's a household name, but obviously he's not. But he's a star. He's a force to be reckoned with. And most importantly, Al was, and I don't know, he might still be, I haven't really heard anything Ministry's done in the last 25 years. But in the 80s, he was a legit producer. Everything he touched, he had the Midas touch in the 80s. Absolutely did. If Al's name was on a record, you picked it up. You didn't think about it. You didn't even listen to it. You bought it on faith. And he never disappointed. Al had, you know, he had, in my opinion, it seemed like he had a supreme dedication to his audience. To be honest and to deliver a high quality product. And he always did. And he surrounded himself with people that were talented as he saw them. And he tended to bring people into the, into ministry and into the Revolting Cocks. They'd all tour together. He wasn't selfish with how he handed out writing credits and singing ability. He had Chris Connolly sing on ministry songs. Like, the guy was a very open person, at least on the surface he was, to us fans. At any rate, Al was a legend. I know this video is about Skinny Puppy, but he came in to work on this. Now, Ogre from Skinny Puppy, he had brought Al in. This is the way I remember it, but he brought Al Jourgensen in to do this. The other dudes in the band, Dwayne Gotel and Kevin Key, were not so keen on this. Now, those of you who know more about the situation, correct me, but I was there at the time, and this is the way I remember reading it. There were interviews with people in Skinny Puppy and Al, and they all seemed to think that Al getting into the band to produce this record was of Ogre's choice. The other two weren't so keen on it. Now, this album is, by the way, this hole you see here, this is something that American record labels would do to denote that it's a promo. This is a promo copy. Usually they do a hole like this, or they'd make a slice, like there'd be a slice here, or there'd be a promo stamp, or both, or all three. This is something the American market did to show that this was a promo and not to be resold. Of course, everybody resold these. It was totally commonplace. Anyway, I think among most Skinny Puppy fans, or at least the old school hardcore ones, they look at this album as their worst album because it's not the most Skinny Puppy album. I would heartily argue with those people. Now, I am a huge Skinny Puppy fan. I have been since the mid-'80s when I was a kid. I've been there for most of their albums as they were released. And Rabies is my favorite. And it's not because Al is on it, or maybe indirectly it's because of Al. And I love Ministry, absolutely love them, and love Al, most of what he's done. So Al's influence on Rabies is only a good thing, in my opinion. Now, does Rabies sound like the majority of Skinny Puppy records? No, it doesn't. There are a few songs down here that sound like classic Skinny Puppy. But for the most part, this sounds like Skinny Puppy with a heavy Al Jourgensen influence. To me, I don't understand how that's a bad thing. We have to remember that Skinny Puppy was a band of experimentation. This is how they started. They were all about experimentation of sound, experimentation on stage, which, by the way, those of you who saw Skinny Puppy live will know what I'm talking about. I saw them live on this concert, on this tour, by the way. Insane show. It was so cool. I just remember fake blood and stilts and costumes and makeup. It was like a horror show set to techno beats. It was fucking awesome. Anyway, that's another story. But Al was a great addition to this, and I will argue anybody who disagrees with me. Skinny Puppy was an experimentation as a whole. Musically, the way they presented themselves live, always an experimentation. So to bring Al in, I thought was just an evolution of that experimentation that they dedicated themselves to. And Al took them to a different level. And Rabies is, to this day, one of the most powerfully aggressive albums you will ever hear. And when I say aggressive, I mean that mentally. It's like you're not going to want to go out, unless you're completely deranged and disturbed, you're not going to want to go out and be aggressive towards other people. But when you listen to this album, you have to be ready to be challenged, both sonically and lyrically, because it is a very aggressive, angry album, as a lot of Skinny Puppy Ministry records are. But there's a real true beauty to it, and it flows. Skinny Puppy albums, they didn't always flow perfectly, in my opinion. Sometimes, they could tend to be a bit of a singles band. Like there would be 2 or 3 singles on the album, and then a couple songs that weren't so great. But this is the one album that just flows. Everything on here is fantastic. Now, the sound, I'll talk about the cover here, actually. The cover alone, I think, is a really good intro to the album. You've got this Looney Tunes, what that's all folks background here. which immediately sends signals to your brain like, this is child friendly, it's Looney Tunes, Elmer Fudd is behind all this. But then you zoom in to the foreground here and you have Charles Manson, war atrocities, you have Tiananmen Square, you have Adolf fuckface Hitler, but then you have a splat, like an animated splat sign here, some other Nazi imagery. I always thought this was a very cool cover. You've got this background of joy as it's implanted in our brains as we grow up from childhood, and then you've got all this other stuff that was happening at the same time. This to cloud your mind, but this to remind you of the reality. So it's a really cool cover. And it continues on the back. We have, I forget his name, I'm sorry. This was the dude behind the Tiananmen Square riots. More Tiananmen Square, I think it was, or maybe those are Nazis. I don't know. This looks like I don't know, could be Reagan from The Exorcist or something. Anyway. Oh, and then you've got I think this is probably the seal from Al Jourgensen. It's some Federal Reserve of Chicago. I think they recorded this in Chicago, which was Al Jourgensen headquarters and Wax Trax headquarters. At any rate, it's a very cool juxtaposition of joy as we know it from childhood and then this foreground of horror. And that's kind of what the album sounds like. It's fun, it's exuberant, lots of energy, but then some really dark lyrics. And it works, man. It works like nobody's business. Maybe arguably works better than any other angry, aggressive album in history. It starts off with Rodent. Rodent is one of the best Skinny Puppy songs. In my opinion, actually, the two greatest songs that ever got released by Skinny Puppy are both on this album. And both released as singles, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But the rest of the album is great too. We have Rodent starting off the album, which is just like this slow 100 BPM groove, weird samples. That was the other thing about this album too. There's a lot of horror movie samples and a lot of weird dictator type samples, and Rodent starts off with that. But the one difference is there are some crunching guitars on it from Al Jourgensen. Now, this is something that pisses off Skinny Puppy fans because they never indulged with the guitars. But they did on this. And it's no bad thing. Again, experimentation, folks. That's what it's all about. And Rodent is a kick-ass track. It's very intense, very political, very angry, and sonically awesome. Unfortunately, this vinyl press, this is the original US vinyl press on Capitol Records. I'll show off the label here really quick. You can see my eye through the spindle hole. Anyway, this is the US press on Capitol. This isn't a great press. They repressed this a couple years ago. And I'm wondering if that sounds better, but this was never a great press. It actually sounds kind of muffled. I've heard digital versions of it, and it sounds much better than this. I don't know if it was just the press or what, but never a great pressing. But at any rate, Rodent starts off one of the best albums of all time in a furious manner. Great stuff. Then it heads into Hexenkong, I don't know, an unintelligible, unpronounceable name for the second song. But that one's also another very Ministry-esque song. Some guitars, kind of like this glam, stompy beat. Almost sounds like a Gary Glitter song in a weird, demented way. But just kind of like that stomp. And again, the guitars are there. Growling vocals from Ogre. He's yelling. Great stuff. Just a very cool all-around vibe and nothing that sounds remotely like it. And, piercing political vocals. A nice way to have, a nice way to bring anybody into a great album. The third song is, that one is a little more downtown. It's called Two-Time Grime, I think. Two-Time Grime is the third song. It's a little slower, brings the beat down a little bit. Again, it sounds like a Ministry track. Revolting Cox style track. You can hear Al in the production for sure. Again, not a bad thing. more politicized vocals, production levels off the chart. That's another thing about this album. It's got some songs on here that are just a clinic in electronic music production. Another thing that's great that Al brought to this band. Not that Skinny Puppy were bad producers in any stretch of the imagination, but Al was definitely on another level. And Two Time Grind was another example. Now, the fourth track on the side, and the final track on side one, is Fascist Jock Itch. That, in my opinion, is the most blatant Ministry song on the album. It's really fast, sounds like a metal track, and it's awesome. It is such a good song. It does sound like metal, but, you know, as someone who likes metal, but likes some industrial electro sprinkled in there with growling vocals, you can't get any better than Two Time Grime. Two Time Grime is a phenomenal piece of work, and that ends the first side on this album. The next song is Warlock, which I'll go into in a minute here because that was a single. Following Warlock, we have Rain. Rain is a short interlude track. In fact, it sounds... that song sounds more like traditional Skinny Puppy, maybe arguably, than any other song on the album. It's a very short song. It's an ambient style track, no vocals on it. And then it leads into Tin Omen, which is one I'll talk about again in a moment because that was the other single from the album. And then the last two songs on the album are Rivers and Corleone. Rivers, again, is more traditional Skinny Puppy. Instrumental, lots of movie samples. To my memory, it has a lot of 2001 samples. You hear Hal on there, Hal 9000, 99? God, I can't remember. It's one of my favorite movies. Hal's on there a lot. Lots of sci-fi samples on that track. But that one sounds definitely more like a traditional Skinny Puppy track. And then Corleone is, again, kind of like more of an ambient piece that ends the album. I shouldn't say ambient. It's a little more down-tempo. Probably the weak point on the album, in my opinion. The way it ends, it just kind of fizzles out. Could have been more powerful. Everything leading up to it was so bombastic in your face. But then it just kind of trickles away. And yeah, I guess kind of limply. The album ends kind of limply, in my opinion. But still, by the end of this, you've never heard an album like this. Rabies, okay? Now, I'm going to get into the singles here. The first single from the album is this, Tin Omen. Now this, my friends, is one of the coolest tracks and a clinic in musical production. Doesn't get any better than this. Al Jourgensen produced this, and it is some really, really out of this world production and creativity, and it's just an amazing song. It's something you have to experience. It's got electro mixed with metal, mixed with some techno, mixed with some heavy editing. The crossfading edit, it's not even crossfading, not like the crossfading we hear today with DJ mixes, but there's this part in the middle of the song where Jourgensen is editing sounds of bullets firing and beats hitting, but then pulling back, and it's like you're in the middle of a war zone, and it's all music. It is completely intense, and the centerpiece of what is a very excellent album. And this was the first single. This predated the album by a month or two. Also of note, it's got a couple of B-sides on it, Amputate and Spawn Dirge. Now, those of you who bought the CD version of this, you'll know that those tracks got released onto the CD version, but they were not on the vinyl version. However, if you got this single, you'd have those tracks on vinyl. And they're good. Amputate is more of a traditional Skinny Puppy song, and Spawn Dirge is like this 17-minute live jam. It's not a song that I remember hearing on an album anywhere or on a single, so I'm assuming maybe it's just a song they did live. I don't know. I don't remember them doing it live when I saw them. But at any rate, you're getting 20 extra minutes of B-sides on here. There's the remixes. You have the album version of Tin Omen, and then there's a remix of Tin Omen. The remix isn't that great. It's not that different. It just sounds like a slightly adulterated edit version of the album version. Not great, not a great remix, but the B-sides definitely make it worth it. But this is just something you need to get anyway. if you like this album. This is some excellent stuff. I'm going to take a drink real quick. Now, see those people who have the editing power and the time? They'd go in and just slice that up. You would never see it. But me, I'm going to torture you. I'm going to make you watch me drink water. And you wonder why I only have 16 views on my videos. Moving on. The second single from this album is this here puppy here, Warlock. This is right there with Tin Omen and their best songs ever. In fact, arguably, this is the greatest song Skinny Puppy ever made. And I want to remind people that this was indeed produced and mixed by good old Al Jourgensen. And anybody who says that this is not a great song, you're just full of shit. You're not paying attention at all. This is an inspiring piece of work. Really great song. Couple B-sides. Actually, just one, that's right. Brack Talk is on the B-side. There's another kind of half-assed remix of Tin Omen on here. And there's an extended edit of Warlock on here. Sounds like the album version. They just kind of extended a few minutes. Nothing too different. Now, the story behind... Oh, by the way, the story behind Tin Omen, I think this was inspired by Tiananmen Square. If you don't know what Tiananmen Square is, go look that up. I'm not going to get too political here, but check out Tiananmen Square. This Warlock single was more about censorship. If you've ever seen the video to this, in fact, it shows a lot of clips from horror movies from the 70s and 80s. Lots of gore, lots of blood, lots of really fun scenes from some, really gory, sloppy movies. I can remember there was a lot of clips from Dario Argento in there. I remember seeing Suspiria in there, Tenebrae in there. Then it just has various clips of gore. I'm trying to think of the movies off the top of my head. I think there's Altered States was in there. Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer was in there. That's a great movie. Those of you who have never seen Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. I think Maniac is in there, the original one. The Lustig one, not that horrible shit that Elijah Wood made. That was just a fucking awful movie. Remake of the original Maniac. What else was in there? Maybe Scanners? Or no, wait. Maybe Scanners was in there, or some David Cronenberg movie. Or Videodrome. It was Videodrome. Scanners is actually sampled on Fascist Jock Itch. I forgot to mention that. The sample where you hear the guy saying, "Brothers should be close, don't you think?" That's Scanners. I can't remember the dude. Was his name Ironside? Michael Ironside? There's this badass character actor from the 70s and 80s. He always played like a kick-ass bully thug. And then his real name on top of that was Michael Ironside. Isn't that the perfect name for a bully? I mean, it's just perfect. It's awesome. But anyway, Scanners, Fascist Jock Itch. At any rate, Warlock is arguably one of their best songs and based on censorship. I think that I don't know the full story behind it. I think that's what this rated R is about. But I know in Canada at the time, Canada in the 80s had gone through some really serious oppressive rating systems where they were not able to get R-rated movies or violent movies or movies with sex in them. It was just very hard. I think Canada might have been one of the worst countries on the planet to get those kinds of movies into. So I think Skinny Puppy was making a comment on that and saying, these movies are harmless. We like horror movies and gory movies. Just because you like gory movies doesn't mean that you're a psycho, doesn't mean that you're a weirdo. You just enjoy them. They're fantasy, and let's embrace that fantasy. And to me, that's how I always took this. Sonically and musically, though, this is a beautiful song. A really haunting melody, really cool samples. You hear Charles Manson mumbling over the top. "Now is the only thing that's real." That's Charles Manson. So some disturbing, weird vocal samples, but some really beautiful production and melody and vocal work and lyrics. A perfect song. One of the few perfect songs of the 80s, Warlock. Not just industrial or any other genre shit tag term you want to use. I mean, across the board. One of the best songs of all time, Warlock. And Tin Omen. Both great. So, if you want to delve into some of the best moments electronically, industrially, whateverly, you're gonna track these records down. It's worth it. It's worth every penny. And those of you who like electronic music as I do, you know, as I do these videos, you're gonna see that I talk mainly about electronic music because I love electronic music. And you know, as I got into the 90s and into the thousands, and as I got completely swayed by techno music and rave music, as you can see behind me, there's an Aphex Twin record back there. That's the main stuff I got into when I, you know, got into my 20s in the 90s. But as I, you know, the lead-ins to music like these records behind me were these. And if you're ever wondering what the foundations of bands like Autechre and Aphex Twin and Nine Inch Nails, there would be no Nine Inch Nails without Skinny Puppy. I think Trent Reznor would be the first to admit this. If he didn't, he'd be full of shit. Members of Skinny Puppy, you know, routinely worked and did remix work for Trent Reznor. So, you know, these are things we have to keep in mind. You know, these are the precursors to music that we listen to today, and I think that's why it's important to talk about this stuff. Now, there can be a lot of precursor music and records to the stuff we listen to today, but not all of it ages very well. Some of it falls off the wayside and just sounds, you know, it just sounds bad. It's like a bad sound, a bad noise grinding on our earlobes. But this is the shit. This ages really well. This still sounds good over 30 years later. There's a good reason why these records are getting repressed right now. And Skinny Puppy is just one of those bands in the 80s that was well ahead of their time. They managed to have a fan base then, and they have only strengthened and widened that fan base now. They seem to just get more popular as time goes on. And it's really cool to see because, you know, younger fans of this band who might just be getting into these guys or just getting into them in the last 20 years, who weren't around in the 80s and early 90s when they were putting their stuff out, you can view their past catalog. You can only view it from your experiences today, right? If you were born 20 years ago or 25 years ago, you don't have any context as to what these sounded like when they first came out. And hopefully that's what I can do when I make these videos, is give you a perspective of these now and what they sounded like then. And I can comfortably say that these songs carried a ton of import then, and they still do. They have not aged a day. In fact, when I heard them back then, it was like a mini revolution in my head. It was just stuff that there wasn't anything out there that you could hear that was like this. It was wholly unique style of music. There's a ton of industrial, electronic, new wave stuff out there that was okay, but you knew even then it wasn't going to stand the test of time. Skinny Puppy was one of those bands that you just knew that you'd be listening to this 20 years or 30 years down the road. It's just too unique, it's too original, and it's too topical in terms of politics. I think if you sing about politics, you know, history repeats itself in general. We tend to repeat our mistakes and we don't learn from our mistakes. And that is another reason why Skinny Puppy is a very relevant band. They sing about real issues now. They sang about real issues then. And those issues are still the same fuck-ups that we all make. All the governments make, all we make as individuals. That's why you can carry that experience from then into now and have it not age a day. And that's why Rabies is at the very top of that filthy industrial Rabies-encrusted mountain. If you're a Skinny Puppy fan, I'm sorry if you don't like this album because of Al Jourgensen's involvement. I can kind of understand your complaint, but not really. Just deal with it. Al Jourgensen created one of the great records of our time that wasn't called a Ministry album. And I'll talk about Ministry albums too. There are Ministry albums that I think are better than Rabies. But in terms of other stuff that Al was able to do for other bands, it does not get much better than this here. I feel like I could keep rambling on about this, but I'm going to shut up now. I've been going on. I only wanted to talk for 20 minutes, and it's approaching 35 minutes. I'm trying to think of anything else about this. I feel like there's a lot to say, but again, these precursor albums are important to discuss, I think, because it's easy to skip over sounds and influences that you're into now and not hear where those influences might have come from. But, you know, bands like Skinny Puppy, I think, in terms of sampling and beats and production, they introduced a lot of new ideas, and those new ideas were basically being a political band, but having a new wave background and having juggernaut heavyweight producers like Al Jourgensen bringing guitar riffs. It's just so much. Rabies is it's so much going on at once. It's metal and techno and dance music and ambient music and synthesizer music. When you bring all these pieces together, it's hard to make a cohesive experience, and they do that with Rabies. So those of you who are into electronic music at all, don't waste any more time. Get to it. All right, I'm going to shut up now. I'll talk to you next time.